My name is Sophia Bennett. I am 34 years old. 4 years ago, I discovered the devastating secret that my husband and the rest of my family had buried us under crushing debt, while I spent 12 years supporting his dreams and managing our life without pay. Right now, as we sit in the mediation room at the family law office in our small Western Virginia city for the final signing of the divorce settlement, my family is smiling like they have already won everything they demanded. My husband looks so smug, my mother-in-law is nodding approvingly, and my brother-in-law is leaning back with his arms crossed, like this is just another family victory. My husband's lawyer leaned in and whispered 5 words that made my husband's face drain of all color. But after everything they had put me through, I sat there with a quiet smile, because I knew the truth they still did not. If you have ever had your own family turn on you and try to take everything while hiding their own mess, hit that like button and comment below with the city you are watching from and what your family tried to pull on you. I read every single one. Let me take you back so you understand how we reached this moment in that mediation room, because no one outside my family knew the real story. I met my husband Marcus Bennett when I was 18. I had just finished high school early and landed a job as a receptionist at a small real estate office in town. He was 23, full of big plans about building a property empire that would change our lives. We got married when I was 19. Our son Caleb came along when I was 21. I kept working part-time while raising him and putting every extra dollar into my own retirement account, because my grandmother had always drilled into me that a woman should have something that was hers alone. When I was 24, my husband's business finally started to take off. He asked me to quit my job and help him full-time. He needed someone he could trust to handle the books, coordinate with contractors, manage clients, and keep the whole operation running smoothly. So I did it. I became his unpaid everything, while still raising our son, managing our household, and making sure the family ran like clockwork. For 9 years, I poured myself into that business. I handled the marketing setup, open houses, dealt with vendors, and kept the finances straight. At every industry event, I was just my husband's wife. He took the credit, the awards, the applause, and never once mentioned the woman who kept it all together behind the scenes. Somewhere along the way, things started to shift. My husband began making decisions without me. He stayed late more often. He started criticizing small things about how I dressed, or how I kept the house, or how I lacked ambition, even though I was basically running his entire back office for free. Then 2 months ago, he dropped the bomb one evening while I was folding laundry. He sat me down and said he wanted a divorce. He wanted the house, the cars, the business, everything. I could keep our son, he said, like Caleb was an afterthought, being generously left with me. What I did not know at the time was that my family had been planning this exit for months. My husband already had his lawyer Kevin Walsh on speed dial. My mother-in-law, Vivian Bennett, had been whispering in his ear for weeks about how I had not been supportive enough. Even my brother-in-law, Keith Bennett, who never missed a chance to insert himself into family business, had been pushing the idea that my husband deserved a fresh start. They all saw me as the obstacle to their perfect picture. The next week, my mother-in-law showed up at our house with her perfectly practiced, concerned face. She patted my hand and told me I should have tried harder to keep my husband happy. Men have needs, she said, like I was some slow child who needed the lesson explained. She had treated me like hired help for 12 years, but now she was here to help pack my things, or so she claimed. By help, she meant she went through my belongings and decided what I deserved to keep. Old clothes, fine. Some family photos, okay. My grandmother's recipe box, she hesitated over that one, like she was considering claiming it for herself. Anything of real value was off limits. Those were marital assets, she explained, and my husband was entitled to them. She packed my life into garbage bags, not boxes. Garbage bags like I was trash being hauled away. Through all of it, I had one person I thought I could count on. My best friend, Brooke Lawson. We had been close since high school, 20 years of friendship through everything. She was the first one I called after my husband announced the divorce. She came over with coffee and let me cry on her shoulder. She told me I deserved better and that my husband was making a huge mistake. But little things started to feel off. My husband seemed to know my plans before I made them. When I mentioned to my best friend that I was thinking about fighting for more time with our son, my son came home the next day, repeating things his father had said about how I was making everything difficult. When I told my best friend I was looking at apartments in a certain neighborhood, my husband made a comment about that exact area being too expensive for me. It clicked one afternoon when I saw the way my best friend lit up when my husband walked into the room during one of her visits. She had been carrying a torch for him for years. He knew it and used it, feeding her just enough attention and empty promises to keep her loyal. My best friend had become my family's spy. 20 years of friendship sold out for some flirting and the hope that she might end up with him once I was gone. The worst part was watching what it did to our son Caleb. He saw the girlfriend Taylor Reed moving her things into our house. He saw my mother-in-law packing my bags in garbage bags. He saw my husband looking at me like I was nothing. My husband was working on him every day, dripping poison about how I was the one dragging things out and making it hard for everyone to be happy. Caleb started pulling away from me. Not angry exactly, just distant and confused. He did not know who to believe, and his father was very convincing. I hired my lawyer, Rachel Morgan. She was sharp and no nonsense, and she reviewed everything I told her. "You helped build this business," she said. "You are entitled to half of everything. We fight." I looked at her for a long moment. "What if I do not want to fight?" I asked. She stared at me like I had lost my mind. She thought I was broken and too beaten down to stand up for myself. She had no idea. I moved into a small apartment with our son. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen the size of my old pantry. Half our boxes did not even fit. They sat stacked in the corner of his room like a reminder of how far we had fallen. Meanwhile, my husband posted photos with Taylor Reed. "New chapter, new energy," he wrote. My mother-in-law commented underneath, "So happy for you, sweetheart. You deserve joy." Everyone had advice. My sister-in-law, who I had never been close to, called and told me I needed to take him for everything he was worth. Everyone saw a woman who had given up. Everyone was wrong. Being underestimated had its advantages. People stopped watching me. They stopped guarding their secrets. And that is exactly when I learned everything I needed. 4 years earlier, on a random night when my husband was working late again, I'd been going through the company books. I found strange transfers, then a pattern. Money flowing out to accounts I did not recognize. I stayed up until 3 in the morning following the trail. What I found made my blood run cold. The house we lived in had 3 mortgages on it. The original loan of $400,000, a second mortgage of $300,000 taken out 3 years earlier, and a third of another $300,000. Total owed $1,300,000. The actual value of the house was only $800,000. We were underwater by $500,000 on a home I thought we owned outright. The business was worse. Lines of credit, maxed out back taxes, owed vendor debts, equipment loans. The company my husband bragged about at every gathering was drowning in $450,000 of debt. Even the cars were leased with balloon payments coming due. We did not own anything. We had expensive monthly obligations. Total debt around $1,800,000. Total actual asset value maybe $1,500,000. We were $300,000 in the hole, maybe more. The money had gone to cryptocurrency investments that tanked gambling losses, an apartment my husband kept for someone I did not know about, and lifestyle expenses that never made it home. My family was not building an empire. They were building a house of cards. My first instinct was to confront them. But I knew my husband. If I said anything, he would manipulate me, make me feel crazy, and probably blame me. Worse, he might try to take control of my separate money, too. I had kept my retirement account from my early job days, and my grandmother had left me $290,000 in her will with clear instructions that it was for me alone. I had never commingled it. By then, with growth, it was around $440,000 that was completely legally mine. So I did not confront them. Instead, I worked with my uncle Richard Hayes, a retired accountant, to create an irrevocable trust for our son. My retirement and inheritance went into it. It was untouchable. Then I documented everything, every mortgage, every loan, every suspicious transaction. I kept copies at my cousin Emma Clark's house. I put copies in a safe deposit box. I saved everything on an encrypted drive. And then I waited. I knew my family would eventually decide I was no longer useful. Men like my husband and the relatives who backed him always did. I just had to be ready when it happened. 4 years of waiting, 4 years of smiling at family gatherings while knowing our entire life was built on quicksand. I got very good at patience and very good at pretending I did not know my family was financially drowning us all. When my husband finally asked for the divorce, when he demanded the house, the cars, the business, everything with my mother-in-law and my brother-in-law, cheering him on, I almost laughed. He was not asking for assets. He was demanding debt. He just did not know it yet. In the mediation room that day, I placed 3 binders on my lawyer, Rachel Morgan's desk. 4 years of evidence. She read in silence. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed completely. "You knew about this for 4 years," she said. "I was waiting for them to make their move," I told her. "I knew my family would eventually, and when they demanded everything, they demanded all the debt. They just do not understand that yet." My lawyer leaned back. The pity left her eyes. What replaced it was something like respect. "So when you sign over the assets, you walk away clean. They get the mortgages, the business debts, the lease obligations, all of it becomes their sole responsibility. And your inheritance, your retirement account, separate property, never commingled, legally protected, sitting safely in the trust for your son." My lawyer was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled a slow, dangerous smile. "Mrs. Bennett," she said, "I believe I owe you an apology. I thought you had given up." I smiled back. "Everyone thinks that. That is kind of the point. The trap was already built. The numbers were verified. The documentation was airtight. All I had to do was let my family think they were winning. And nobody does gracious loser better than a woman who has been practicing for 12 years. The next 8 weeks were a master class in acting. I became exactly what my family expected me to be, broken, defeated, barely holding on. I showed up to mediation sessions with red eyes and trembling hands. I spoke softly, hesitantly, like a woman who had lost all her confidence. I asked for so little that even the mediator seemed uncomfortable. "I just want enough to start over," I said during our second session. "I am not trying to be difficult. I know the business is my husband's life's work. I know the house means everything to him. I do not want to tear our family apart more than it already is. I requested a settlement of $40,000 cash, my personal belongings, and shared custody of our son." That was it. My husband agreed immediately. He was probably expecting me to fight for half of everything. Instead, I was asking for crumbs. He looked at me across that mediation table with something almost like pity. I deserved an award for that performance. With each passing week, my family's arrogance grew. My husband stopped being careful. He started telling everyone who would listen that I had not even fought. "She just gave up," he told his golf buddies. "I offered her a fair settlement and she took it without a word." My mother-in-law was even worse. She bragged at her book club and every social gathering. "My husband is keeping everything. That woman did not get a dime." I always knew she was not strong enough for my son. To celebrate his upcoming victory, my husband bought himself a new watch, $12,000. He wore it to our next mediation session, making sure I noticed. He also took Taylor Reed to dinner at the nicest restaurant in town. He posted photos. "Life is good when you are with the right person," he wrote. The right person. He meant the one who did not know about his debt yet. Meanwhile, Taylor Reed had started redecorating our old house. New furniture, new art. She even painted the kitchen a plain gray. I had spent weeks choosing the perfect warm tone 3 years earlier, and she painted over it like it was nothing. Gray like her future with my husband when she found out the truth. Very fitting, actually. My best friend kept calling fishing for information under the guise of friendship. I played along perfectly. "How are you holding up?" she would ask, her voice dripping with fake concern. I just want it to be over, I would tell her, making my voice crack slightly. I cannot fight anymore. I do not have the energy. Within hours, my husband would know. I could practically see him relaxing, letting his guard down even further. My best friend thought she was playing me. She was actually just being a messenger service. But while the adults were playing their games, our son Caleb was watching. And our son, my smart, observant, 14-year-old, was starting to notice things that did not add up. He noticed his father's new watch, but heard my husband tell him they could not afford the school trip to the mountains. He noticed Taylor Reed's shopping bags piling up, but heard my husband complain about money being tight. One evening, our son came to my small apartment and sat down at my secondhand kitchen table. He looked at me with those serious eyes, so much like his father's, but with something my husband had lost long ago. "Mom," he said quietly, "is Dad actually doing okay financially?" I looked at our son for a long moment. "What do you think I asked?" He was quiet, processing. "I think something is not right. I think he is pretending." I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Trust me, just wait a little longer." Behind the scenes, my lawyer, Rachel Morgan, was preparing our legal strategy with surgical precision. The main divorce agreement stated clearly that I was relinquishing all claims to marital property. The house, the business, the vehicles, everything would go to my husband. In exchange, I would receive my modest cash settlement and walk away. But attached to that agreement was an addendum, a detailed liability disclosure statement. Every debt, every mortgage, every loan, every obligation tied to those assets. When my husband signed for all assets, he would be legally assuming all liabilities. It was all there in black and white. Legal, proper, devastating. 2 weeks before the final mediation, my husband's lawyer, Kevin Walsh, called my lawyer with concerns. "My client is assuming significant assets," he said carefully. "I would like to request a full financial audit before we finalize, just to verify everything." My lawyer kept her voice neutral. "Of course we will provide whatever documentation you need." But when Kevin Walsh brought this to my husband, my soon-to-be ex-husband, shut it down immediately. "No audits," my husband told him. "I built that company. I know exactly what it is worth. I am not paying for some accountant to tell me what I already know." Kevin Walsh pushed back. "I strongly recommend we verify the asset values before you sign. This is a significant step." "No," my husband cut him off. "Taylor Reed wants this done. I want this done. No more delays." Kevin Walsh had been practicing law for over 25 years. He knew when a client was about to make a mistake. He presented my husband with a waiver, acknowledging that he had recommended an independent financial review and that my husband was declining against counsel's advice. My husband signed it without reading it, just like he would sign everything else without reading it. Never underestimate the power of an impatient girlfriend to make a man skip the fine print. Taylor Reed was worth her weight in gold to me in legal strategy. The night before the final mediation, my husband sent me a text message. "Thank you for not making this ugly." I stared at that message for a long time. 12 years of marriage, 12 years of building his business, raising our son, managing his life, and he was thanking me for not making things difficult for him while he threw me away. I typed back, "I just want what is best for our son." What was best for our son? His trust fund, his future secured, and a father who was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life. My lawyer called me that evening. "Final mediation tomorrow morning at 9. Are you ready?" I looked around my small apartment, the secondhand furniture, the boxes still unpacked in the corner. The tiny kitchen I had painted a soft, warm green because it reminded me of hope. I have been ready for 4 years. Tomorrow morning, my husband would walk into that mediation room expecting to collect his prize. He had no idea he was about to inherit a financial avalanche, one he had signed for himself. And the best part, he had asked for it in writing with witnesses. The next morning, I walked into that mediation room with my head held high, even though my hands were shaking just enough to sell the act. My husband was already there, flanked by my mother-in-law on one side and my brother-in-law on the other, like they had formed some kind of family war council. They all looked so confident, so certain that this was the day they finally got everything they had demanded from me after 12 years of me carrying the weight. My lawyer, Rachel Morgan, sat beside me, calm and prepared with the binders I had given her weeks earlier. The mediator cleared her throat and began walking through the final pages of the agreement. My husband signed, first barely glancing at the lines, as if speed mattered more than details. My mother-in-law leaned over and whispered something in his ear that made him nod with a satisfied smirk. My brother-in-law crossed his arms and muttered loud enough for me to hear that it was about time we wrapped this up so everyone could move on with their lives. I signed slowly, deliberately, making sure every page had my name on it exactly where it needed to be. When the last signature was done, the mediator slid the full packet across the table for one final review by the opposing side. That is when my husband's lawyer, Kevin Walsh, flipped to the addendum. I watched his expression change from professional detachment to sudden confusion. He leaned in close to my husband and started whispering urgently. The color drained from my husband's face so fast it looked like someone had pulled a plug. His hands started trembling on the table the same way they had when he first heard those 5 words from his own lawyer days earlier. My mother-in-law noticed immediately and demanded in a sharp voice what on earth was going on. My brother-in-law tried to play it off with a forced chuckle, but the sound came out strained and unnatural, like he knew something had just shifted beneath their feet. My husband shoved the papers back toward Kevin Walsh, his voice rising. "This cannot be right. She hid all of this. This is some kind of trick." The mediator raised her hand for calm, but my mother-in-law cut in. First, her tone laced with that familiar cold sarcasm that had always cut me deepest. "Oh, please do not start playing the victim now. You agreed to this settlement yourself." My brother-in-law jumped in right behind her, his reaction turning to sudden defensive anger as he slammed a palm on the table. "You are not going to ruin this for him after everything he has built." The room felt like it was closing in with their combined voices, creating that familiar family pile-on I had endured for years. My lawyer stayed perfectly composed. "Everything is exactly as disclosed in the documents," she said evenly. "Your client chose to sign without the recommended audit. He waived that right in writing." My husband looked at me across the table, his eyes wide with the first real panic I had seen in months. "You knew!" His voice cracked on the words. "You knew about the mortgages, the loans, everything, and you let me walk into this." I met his gaze without flinching. "I was the one who kept the books for 9 years, I reminded him quietly. "I knew about everything." My mother-in-law's face twisted into something between shock and fury. She had never expected me to speak up, let alone push back with facts. Her usual control slipped for a second and she snapped at my brother-in-law to do something useful and call their other contacts. My brother-in-law's reaction was even more shocking. He stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly across the floor, and he started pacing like a caged animal, muttering about how this was going to destroy the family reputation if it got out. The 3 of them, my husband, my mother-in-law, and my brother-in-law, began arguing among themselves right there in front of the mediator. Their voices overlapping in a chaotic storm of blame and denial. It was the first time I had ever seen them turn on each other even a little, and the sight sent a strange mix of satisfaction and exhaustion through me. The mediator finally called for a short break to let everyone collect themselves. As we stepped into the hallway, my best friend was waiting outside pretending to be there for moral support. She had clearly been texting my husband updates because the moment she saw his pale face, she rushed over and placed a hand on his arm in a way that felt far too familiar. Our son, Caleb, had asked to sit in the waiting area, and I caught him watching the whole scene from a chair near the window, his expression a complicated blend of confusion and dawning realization. He had been so distant these past weeks, but something in his eyes shifted when he saw his father looking rattled for the first time. During the break, my cousin Emma Clark, who had been my quiet confidant through the worst of the packing and moving, sent me a quick text asking if I needed her to come down to the office. She had been the one holding the spare copies of every document at her house, in case anything went missing, and her support had kept me steady when my own family tried to isolate me. My uncle Richard Hayes, the retired accountant who had helped me set up the trust for our son, had also offered to testify if it ever came to that. Their presence, even from afar, reminded me I was not completely alone, even if my immediate family had turned against me. When we returned to the table, my husband tried one last desperate push. I want to withdraw the agreement, he announced, his voice shaking with frustration. I did not understand what I was signing. This is not fair. My mother-in-law backed him up immediately, her words dripping with that long-held resentment she had always directed at me. She manipulated you, sweetheart. We all know she has been holding grudges for years. My brother-in-law added his own twist, jumping in with a shocking accusation that I must have forged some of the debt numbers because no one in the family would have let things get that bad. Their reactions were so wildly different from the unified front they had shown for months that it almost felt like watching a carefully built wall start to crack in real time. My lawyer reminded everyone calmly that the waiver my husband had signed explicitly stated he had refused the audit against legal advice. The mediator reviewed the documents again and confirmed the agreement stood. My husband slumped back in his chair, the fight draining out of him as the reality began to sink in. But my mother-in-law was not done. She turned her attention to me with a fresh venom in her voice. "You think this makes you clever?" she hissed. "You will regret burning every bridge in this family." My brother-in-law nodded vigorously, his face flushed with anger as he added that if I thought I could walk away clean, I was mistaken because they would make sure everyone in town knew what kind of person I really was. The threats hung in the air, thick and personal, cutting straight into the places they knew still hurt. I felt my stomach tighten, but I kept my expression neutral. The years of being underestimated had taught me exactly how to hold my ground, even when every word from them felt like another slap. Our son watched from the doorway, his eyes flicking between all of us, and I could see the internal battle playing out on his young face. He had heard every poisoned story from his father and my mother-in-law for months, but seeing the documents and the panic in real time was clearly shaking his trust in their version of events. The mediator wrapped up the session with the official dissolution, but the tension in the room was far from over. As we gathered our things, my husband pulled out his phone and started texting furiously, probably to Taylor Reed, who'd been waiting outside the entire time expecting a celebration. My best friend hovered nearby, looking increasingly uncomfortable, as the reality of what she had helped enable began to dawn on her. Outside in the parking lot, my mother-in-law and my brother-in-law cornered my husband for a heated private conversation, their voices carrying just enough for me to catch fragments about damage control and how they were not going to let one person ruin everything they had worked for. I drove back to the small apartment with our son in the passenger seat. He was quiet for most of the ride, but when we pulled into the parking lot, he finally spoke. "Mom," he said, his voice low. "Dad looks scared back there. Really scared." I nodded, not wanting to push too hard too soon. "Sometimes people have to face what they have built," he replied softly. I squeezed his hand before we went inside, knowing that the next few weeks were going to test all of us in ways I could not fully predict. That evening, my phone started blowing up with messages from my sister-in-law, who had apparently heard a version of events from my brother-in-law. She accused me of sabotage and demanded I fix this for the sake of the family name. My mother-in-law followed up with her own call, leaving a voicemail laced with sarcasm about how I had always been the difficult one and how my choices were now hurting our son more than anyone. The pressure from my family was ramping up again, but this time it felt different, like they were scrambling to regain control rather than casually taking it. I sat at my secondhand kitchen table reviewing the trust documents one more time, the one thing my family still did not know about. The $440,000 in separate assets sat safely protected for our son's future. It was the one piece of security I had carved out during those 4 long years of waiting and pretending. But as I closed the folder, a new text came through from an unknown number. It was short and threatening. "We are not done with you yet. The family has ways of making sure you pay for this." My heart rate spiked because I recognized the style even without a name attached. It had all the hallmarks of my brother-in-law trying to intimidate me behind the scenes, while my mother-in-law cheered him on. Before I could even process the message, another call came in, this time from my husband. His voice on the other end was raw with a mix of anger and something close to desperation. "We need to talk," he said. "Tonight, just us. No lawyers." "There are things you do not understand about how this affects everyone, including our son." I could hear my mother-in-law in the background urging him to push harder. The call ended with him demanding I meet him at a neutral spot downtown in 1 hour. I stared at the phone, my mind racing through every possible trap they might be setting. Our son had gone to his room, but I knew he was listening through the thin walls. This was the moment the real fallout would begin, and I had no idea if my careful plan would hold against the full force of my family closing ranks once they realized how deep the hole actually was. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual as I weighed whether to go or to finally draw a line I could never uncross. I stared at the phone for a long moment, weighing every risk. Meeting my husband alone felt like walking into another trap my family had set, but refusing might give them more ammunition to paint me as the unreasonable one. Our son Caleb had overheard enough to look worried when he poked his head out of his room, so I told him I would be back soon and drove to the coffee shop downtown, the neutral spot my husband had demanded. The parking lot was nearly empty under the evening lights, but when I stepped inside, I saw immediately that this was no private talk. My husband sat at a corner table flanked by my mother-in-law on his left and my brother-in-law on his right, their faces already set in matching expressions of righteous anger. They had turned a simple request into a family intervention, and the sight made my stomach tighten with that familiar mix of dread and resolve. My mother-in-law spoke first, her voice low and cutting, with the kind of sarcasm she had perfected over 12 years of treating me like an inconvenience. "You really thought you could pull this off without consequences," she said, leaning forward so the words landed like small knives. My brother-in-law jumped in right after his reaction, shifting from the earlier defensive pacing to a sudden aggressive lean across the table. "We built that life together," he snapped, "and now you are trying to bury us all under your little secret." My husband just sat there, his new watch glinting under the lights as he rubbed his temples, looking more exhausted than I had ever seen him. I stayed calm and reminded them that every number in those documents came from their own records, the ones I had managed for 9 years. My mother-in-law's eyes narrowed, and she delivered another vicious jab laced with long-held resentment. "You were always the one who never quite fit," she said, her tone dripping contempt. "Always playing the quiet helper while resenting the rest of us for actually living." My brother-in-law nodded vigorously, adding that if I thought the town would side with me, I was wrong because they had already started making calls to friends and business contacts, painting me as the one who had hidden problems for years. The threats felt personal and relentless, each one designed to remind me how isolated I had become. The conversation escalated quickly, with my family piling on in ways that felt rehearsed, yet raw. My mother-in-law accused me of destroying our son's future just to spite them, while my brother-in-law warned that they would fight the trust if they had to, claiming I had manipulated my uncle Richard Hayes into helping me. My husband finally spoke, his voice hoarse with frustration and a hint of something like regret, but it was too little too late. "This is not what I wanted," he said, "but you left me no choice by hiding everything." I looked at all three of them and felt a strange clarity settle over me. I had given them exactly what they demanded, and now they were furious that the bill had come due. I stood up without raising my voice and told them the agreement was final, the mediator had ruled, and any further harassment would be documented for my lawyer, Rachel Morgan. My mother-in-law's face flushed with shock at being dismissed so directly, and my brother-in-law muttered a parting threat about how my reputation in our small Western Virginia city would never recover. My husband just stared at the table, the smug confidence from earlier completely gone. As I walked out, I could hear them arguing among themselves, again their voices rising in the quiet coffee shop. It was the sound of a family fracturing under the weight of their own choices, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to fix it. The next few weeks unfolded with the kind of rapid collapse I had quietly anticipated for 4 years. Taylor Reed moved out of the house in the middle of one night, leaving a note that said this was not the life she had signed up for. The gray kitchen she had insisted on painting sat empty while contractors started calling about missed payments. My husband tried to sell the house, but with the mortgages far exceeding the value, buyers vanished and the bank notices piled up. Within 2 months, the business began defaulting on loans, vendors filed claims, and the once thriving real estate operation my family had bragged about started crumbling publicly. My brother-in-law tried to distance himself by claiming he had warned everyone, but the damage spread through our social circle in town faster than I could have imagined. My mother-in-law attempted one last campaign going through mutual friends, and even reaching out to my cousin Emma Clark to pressure me into some kind of family meeting. When that failed, she turned to our son Caleb, feeding him stories about how I'd been planning this betrayal for years. The emotional toll showed on him. He grew quieter at home sometimes, staring at his phone when messages from his father or grandmother came through. I never badmouthed them, but I also refused to pretend everything was fine. The trust I had set up with my uncle Richard Hayes remained untouched, the $440,000 safe for our son's college and future needs. That knowledge gave me strength on the hardest nights when the loneliness of having no real family support settled in. I used the $40,000 cash settlement to cover first month's rent, basic furniture, and enrollment in interior design courses at the local community college. It was the dream I had set aside at 24 to help my husband build his empire, and now I was finally pursuing it on my own terms. My cousin, Emma Clark, became a steady presence stopping by with coffee and encouragement, while my uncle Richard Hayes offered occasional advice on keeping finances separate. Their support felt genuine in a way my immediate families never had, and it helped me rebuild slowly, one decision at a time. Yet the victory came with a heavy, irreversible cost. In our small city, word spread, and some former friends distanced themselves, unwilling to pick sides against my mother-in-law and my brother-in-law, who still held influence in local circles. Our son Caleb navigated the divide with the quiet maturity of a 14-year-old who had seen too much too soon. He chose to stay primarily with me, but visits with his father grew tense and infrequent. There were no dramatic reconciliations, no apologies from my family, only awkward silences, and occasional sharp texts from my mother-in-law reminding me that I had burned bridges permanently. I had my financial freedom and our son's future protected, but the family I had spent 12 years trying to hold together was gone. The loss felt permanent, and it ached in quiet moments when I least expected it. One evening, about 3 months after everything finalized, my husband showed up at my apartment door alone, looking thinner and worn. He asked if we could talk, maybe figure out some way to co-parent without the lawyers. For a second, I saw the man I had married at 19, but then I remembered the garbage bags, the spying, the demands, and the way they had all closed ranks to push me out. "You asked for everything except our son," I told him calmly. "You got exactly what you wanted." I closed the door gently and stood there listening to his footsteps retreat down the hallway. It was not revenge, it was simply the boundary I had finally learned to hold. My life now is smaller, simpler, and entirely mine. The apartment with its soft green kitchen feels like a fresh start. I take classes during the day, work part-time at a local design firm, and spend evenings helping our son with homework or just listening when he wants to talk about the confusion he still carries. The trust ensures he will have options I never had at his age. I have learned that sometimes choosing yourself means accepting the empty spaces where family used to be. It is not the fairy tale ending people expect, but it is real, and it is mine. Thank you for listening to my story. It still feels strange saying it out loud after keeping it hidden for so long, but sharing it here reminds me I am not the only one who has had to walk away from family expectations to find peace. If my experience resonates with you, drop a comment about a time your own family tried to take more than they gave, or what boundary you finally set, even when it cost you everything familiar. I read every single one, and it helps more than you know.